joins us via the University of Auckland. But he has taught and thought and published and supervised many PhD students around the world, taught in France, South Africa, Philippines, New Zealand, Indonesia. Look, I'm not one of those men who feels the need to compete, but regularly I'm called to MC conferences as far away as Adelaide. So it's nice to meet a peer, JC. Also, one of the things I find fascinating about your work is that you work with some very rarely thought of groups and very stigmatized groups, including prisoners, and taking into account prisoners in disaster and emergency, which is, again, pardon my ignorance, something I had not considered until doing a little bit of research on you. And I know you're going to be quite a provocative presenter here today. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, make him very welcome from the University of Auckland, JC Gallaird.
Hello, good morning. I usually apologize for being French and for having an awful accent. But I guess in Australia I have to apologize for living in Auckland as well in New Zealand. And for soon being to apply for a Kiwi passport. But in fairness, I spent most of the past 20 years in the Philippines, so my accent's a bit of everything. But start to worry if I start to say the beast, the city either. That's going to be worrying. Anyway, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. It's my first time in Melbourne, and I feel privileged to be here, especially in this famous and prestigious venue. I'm French, but I love cricket. I know I'm weird. So I mean, it speaks to me somehow. Yes, so we're going to talk about inclusiveness and how to foster inclusiveness in disaster risk reduction, DRR. And I'm going to take you on a musical journey, so I'm going to use music all throughout to sort of illustrate what I'm going to say about inclusiveness. And I'm going to start with a karaoke session. It's the Filipino side of me. I'm not sure if you like karaoke. Do you like singing? I told you I'm weird. Okay, so do you know this song? Time for Miracles by Adam Lambert. Probably good for you if you don't know the song. It's possibly not the best song in the world. So I'm going to show you first the karaoke version of it. So you focus on the lyrics, and then I'm going to show you the music video, the actual music video, and we're going to reflect upon both and how they diverge. Okay, so now you start thinking, why is this weird French guy showing us this thing? My students would say that it's a very cheesy love song that doesn't relate at all to disasters, right? Now, how do I move to the next one? Okay. Now, I'm going to show you the actual music video, and this song was actually the soundtrack for the film, the movie 2012, which is one of these Hollywood disaster movies. So now look at the actual music video with the footages of the movie behind the lyrics, and we'll talk about this afterwards. This is exactly what we call the dominant paradigm, or the hazard paradigm, or what I call the paradigm of the extreme in disaster studies and disaster risk reduction. You have a very, again, plain love story that relates to everyday life, which doesn't connect to disasters. And then you have these footages of extreme events with people behaving inappropriately, there's antisocial behaviors, you have people fighting, you have people panicking, and you have all these things that never happen in real life with these extreme events in the background. So you have this disconnect, this divide created between everyday life through the lyrics and these extreme events and inappropriate behaviors in the footages. And this is how we often look at disasters, looking at these events as extreme, extraordinary things that are linked to hazards, that are unpredictable, unbelievable, always unsomething, as the great Ken Hewitt used to say. And here, if we compare the lyrics, the everyday nature of the lyrics with the extraordinary nature of the footages, we create that divide. And we look at disasters outside of the everyday social fabric. and outside of everyday life. And if we look at the footages here, there's no real signs of diversity. There's some sort of ethnic diversity in the footages, but there's no homeless people, there's no older people, there's no people with disabilities, there's no prisoners, etc. Right? So in this dominant view of disasters, we don't have any diversity, we don't have any minorities. We look at these events outside of the regular social fabric. And we think of these events as things that require extraordinary attention. And those minority groups fall between the cracks. And we know this is all untrue now, right? We know that people don't panic in time of disasters. We know that people don't loot in time of disaster. They don't become criminals out of the blue. We know it's not true, right? Now we've moved on, as Maureen said yesterday, towards looking at disasters within the regular social fabric, within the context of everyday life. And this is where inclusiveness comes in the picture. But what does it mean actually to foster inclusiveness? So what I want to do now is to encourage your participation in the talk. I would usually use markers and small pieces of paper because the room is too big, so we're going to have a sort of a more techy version of it. I guess you all have a connected device? Yes? Could you all go to this submative.com page onto your phone or computer? Yes? Then when you're there, please log in as a student. Sorry to take you back to your life as a student. Log in as a student and use the room name Gallaird 1854. And it's Gallaird, it's not the surname of a former Australian Prime Minister. Oops.
And you'll be able to access the site for a small monthly fee.
Yes. So you're looking as a student, and it's Gallaird 1854. And then you answer the question, the first question, only the first question for now, which is how to define, how to capture inclusiveness in one word. I just want one word. If I say inclusiveness, what does come to your mind? Can we? Okay, so we have a few people. We have the word failure, we have the word respect. We had, wait. We had everyone, we had everybody, openness, everyone caring, justice, all, caring, kindness, justice, all of you, everyone, acceptance, belonging, respect, everyone, global, everything, everyone, embrace, holistic, consider, everyone, empowerment, community, all. We won't go through all the words. Thank you for sharing these already. There's one word that doesn't, can we shift back to the slides? There's one word that hasn't come up yet, which is probably the most important to me, but it's not unusual not to see it here. Could we swap back to the slides, please? To the PowerPoint? So there's one word that doesn't come up here, which is the word power. And fostering inclusiveness is all about addressing power relations. Understanding disasters is all about power relations, right? It's understanding why some people have access to resources available to some, and others don't have access to the same resources. Now, it's about understanding relationships between people. And I want to illustrate that with one more song, one music video by the punk band, the straight edge punk band from Chicago, Rise Against. It's a song about Katrina, and it's a song about the black communities in New Orleans and how they've been affected and what they've been doing in facing Katrina. So I'm going to show you the music video, not to the end, but for... Okay, so the song shows us, or the video shows us two things. First, that these minority groups in disasters are made vulnerable by forces, the drivers beyond their own grasp. And this is the final bit here in the video where they are calling for help. The helicopter is flying around but doesn't give notice to them. So they've been forced into this situation by exogenous forces. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a moment. But at the same time, these people have what we call capacities. So they have resources. They are not helpless in facing this situation. The water is rising, but still they find a way through the roof and seek shelter on top of the house. Right? So they're not helpless despite of being marginalized and being made vulnerable by how power and resources are shared within society. And this is what we observe for most minority groups all over the world in time of disasters. And yesterday there was a panel about LGBTIQ+ and gender minorities. I'm using one more example here about the warrior in Indonesia. These guys, in time of disasters, like this one, it was the eruption of Mount Merapi in 2010 in Java, couldn't seek shelter in the official evacuation centers because they would be discriminated, they would be harassed by other members of society, so they would usually seek shelter with friends and hide and can't get access, obviously, to resources, relief goods, and this kind of things that others have access to because they are marginalized in everyday life. But at the same time, they were providing resources to everyone in the evacuation centers. They started to organize themselves and started to distribute relief goods into evacuation centers where none of them were hosted at the time. And they were initially denied access because these warriors don't have access to the evacuation center. And they started to be accepted in the evacuation centers when they started to provide free haircut and free manicure services to the evacuees. And that proved super useful because none of these aid organizations providing support in the evacuation centers usually care for these everyday well-being things that they care for. And that's how they became accepted, because they were the only one providing those types of services. And the important thing here is that these capacities, these skills they were offering to the evacuees were nothing coming out of the blue. They were just the extension of what they do in everyday life, because many of these guys work in beauty parlors and hairdresser shops. And this is one of the important points I want to make here, is that when we deal with disasters and when we deal with these minorities, as much as with everyone else basically, we're dealing with these exogenous forces, drivers of vulnerability, that lie beyond the hands of those who are vulnerable. You are made vulnerable by how power and resources are shared within society. So they are largely exogenous. But these capacities, like for these black family in New Orleans who were just going through the roof, or like the warrior in Indonesia, the capacities are largely endogenous. They have control of them. This is their local knowledge, skills, resources, extended from everyday life. And this is important because if you deal with disaster risk reduction, it's going to be so much easier to enhance capacities than to address the root causes of vulnerability. I'm always concerned, if not pissed off, by my NGO friends when we start a training called Mars, and who my friends who tell the people, okay, at the end of the week you're going to be... I mean, addressing vulnerability is a task for those with power. It's about granting access to resources. It's about sharing power in the first place. It's very, very difficult to address the root causes of vulnerability. It's so much easier to enhance capacities because you have control on them, you have grasp on them. And this is going to be crucial. But if we want to foster inclusiveness, it's about both. It's about addressing the root causes of vulnerability and enhancing capacities. So it's going to be a multi-scalar kind of process. Now, this is more or less well acknowledged in policy and practice. Most practitioners will recognize those kind of things. It's somehow in the Sendai framework, so we've talked a bit about it yesterday, the main document guiding policies at the international level now, signed by 187 countries in 2015 in Sendai, Japan. So inclusiveness is often mentioned in the document. And the main goal of the framework is actually mentioning inclusive. What we do for DRR has to be inclusive. So we've gone a long way since the 1970s and there's movies like 2012. Now, if we look more in details into the document, we have this section 5. I used to call it the infamous section 5, but I think I've changed my mind somehow, and there's some good things in it. But there are 6 groups mentioned, named there. And Maureen talked about women yesterday. We have women, we have the children, we have people with disabilities, we have older people, we have the migrants, and we have the indigenous people. Great, they are there. But there's nowhere in the document any framework to actually pull them together. There's nothing about intersectionality. If they are there because of the fantastic individual lobbying of stakeholder groups. So the women group Maureen mentioned yesterday for the women, IOM, the International Organization of Migration, managed to get the migrants in the document. I was very surprised, but they lobbied very, very hard to do that. But this list is far from being exhausted, right? There are people missing there. I'm going to return to that afterwards. So it's a separate lobbying of different organizations, getting to have these groups in the document. And it actually reflects the practice of inclusiveness in disaster risk reduction at the moment. Still, it's changing for the better, but it's still very much emphasized in these 2 reports. I'm using UNISDR reports. It could be any other NGO reports or other organizations' reports. But it's about women and it's about children. If you look at these 2 covers, to me it shows exclusiveness more than inclusiveness. It's only women or only children. And there's an issue here. Because if you work only with children, only with women, it's a good start. You may emphasizing capacities and strengthening capacities, but in no way you address the power relations between these groups and those with power in society. And I'm using here a quote from a student of mine who's soon to submit her master's thesis on Tonga, gender in Tonga. But these guys, whether they're children, gender minorities, or women, or whoever, people are not stupid. They know what their vulnerabilities and capacities are in most instances. The point is to have others, those with power, to recognize what the vulnerabilities of these guys are and what their capacities are. So if you work in the silo only with them, it's a good start, but nowhere you address those power relations. So you need to create a dialogue between insiders and outsiders. And that's the tricky bit. At the moment, we're not doing that very well, except maybe for those working with children. These NGOs, like Save the Children, Plan, World Vision, are doing a good job because they think of children within their families, so they're engaging adults as well. But otherwise, it's not very often the case. And I'm using one example here. I had the chance somehow to be in the drafting committee for the Incheon Declaration on DRR, which was a declaration made at the end of the Asian Ministerial Conference for DRR in 2010 in Korea. And it was one of these late night drafting committee meetings, and out of the blue there was one woman from UNIFEM at the time, it wasn't yet UN Women. Out of the blue she started to advocate, we need women to be there in the document. As Maureen said yesterday, it's good to have these groups named. But, I mean, I was sitting with a guy from Plan Bangladesh and a guy from the IFRC, Red Cross in Bangkok, and we realized, okay, but if we have the women in the document, we need other groups as well, otherwise we further marginalize them. So we had to advocate, and we fought very hard to get just the people with disabilities, I think, children and older people to be there. But we knew we were missing people, and that's one of the major issues. By listing people, and I agree it's important, but by starting to list people, we are sure to miss out on some others. For example, this document. It's a fantastic document, it's exhaustive, and I'm not pushing back against it, right? But possibly the most vulnerable of all groups, and it's a large group, is not there. The most marginalized probably is not there. Prisoners. They are dying in hundreds in disasters. No one gives them any attention. So it's tricky. We're always missing out on some groups. So starting to list them is good in the sense we need them to be recognized, but at the same time we further marginalize those who are not there. And it's tricky because I spend a lot of time in prisons in the Philippines at the moment, and I've started to work, okay, older gender minority members in prisons. It's a sort of never-ending process of starting to list people and the intersectionality. It's tricky, it's very difficult. So whether we should start naming or not, I understand we should do that for the sake of getting things done, but at the same time there are many shortcomings with doing that. So we are facing challenges and opportunities, and I want to expand a bit more on this. I'm going to skip that one because time is flying, I guess. I'm just going to show you another music video. So the thing here with this sort of participatory music video making is that the tool, the video tool, kind of engage these kids with the broader society. Somehow if these kids are able to make their own music video, they are not helpless. I mean, there's something they can do with it. And it makes them somehow tangible, credible, trusted on the DR scene. And building that trust is probably the most important challenges. And I was kind of hoping to get that word out of the other Socrative poll. And it's very difficult to build trust to bridge the gap between the insiders and outsiders. And again, we're doing a lot of work with prisons in the Philippines at the moment. We started with research to try to understand how it works in prisons. And it's a very complicated micro-society in the Philippines. But now we're working towards involving prisoners into the DR planning within the prisons, having DR officers within each and every cell. And it's bringing a dialogue between the prisoners and the wardens and the guards. And it's difficult, although in the Philippines it's not as difficult as you may think. But it's about creating that dialogue. And it's difficult between insiders and outsiders. And you may have seen this diagram before. But the whole point is we need this dialogue to happen if we want to have an integrated process where we have different forms of knowledge coming together and we have different forms of actions coming together. The actions from the bottom up to enhance capacities and the actions from the top down, quote marks, or from the outside to the inside to address the root causes of vulnerability. It's a task for those with power, again. So we need that dialogue to happen, and it's difficult. I'm using this picture again to emphasize the importance of the tools, because we need to open up the platform, we need to open up the space for the dialogue to occur. So we do a lot of participatory mapping with NGOs and local governments. This one was in the Philippines 8 years ago, and we were working with this Bakla community, so the gender minority in the Philippines. And what I want to emphasize on this picture is that this guy here, so we were doing that with the other members of the village to create the dialogue. And this guy here, who was a village councillor at the time, started to laugh at first why we wanted outsiders to actually create a dialogue and involve the Bakla in these DR activities. And ultimately it worked through the process and somehow we got somewhere. The most important thing is that 1 year afterwards, that guy had become the village chief. And at that time we organized a meeting with all the village chiefs in the town to try to discuss how we could reproduce this activity or replicate this activity elsewhere in the town. And so he started to talk about what they had done in their own village. And he mentioned, even the Bakla participated and they contributed things. And we were, wow, that's a big step forward compared to where we were a year ago, where he was laughing about it. And it was good because these guys who are marginalized, it's a whole kind of rural setting, discriminated in the evacuation center, but at the same time do a lot contributing to DRR by collecting relief goods and distributing them on their own without any integration within the formal DRR planning process. So it was a good recognition for them. So it was about building again that trust and that dialogue between the insiders and the outsiders. But in that particular case, we initiated that as outsiders, people coming from Manila in that particular case. And that's somehow an issue. And that leads me to my final point, my conclusion, which is whether there may be an elephant in the room here. A question we haven't asked, we haven't heard about it yet. which is whether it's actually culturally appropriate to foster inclusiveness. And sorry to be blunt here, but we are still very white in this room, all middle-aged, all Westerners, most of us. So we are thinking mostly from a Western perspective. So is it actually culturally appropriate all the time to foster the participation of the kids, the women, the older people in the RR? I know Maureen said it's fair yesterday, but yeah, it's fair, but sometimes, I mean, it can be an issue. Who were we in Nepal a few years ago when we wanted to contribute or to make these kids and these women or this guy who was from a Dalit and untouchable caste participate in this participatory mapping and planning activity? Who were we as outsiders? These kids, it's in the classroom, their own classroom at the school. At the start of the training, they were kicked out. And by kicked out, I mean kicked out by the adults. 1 week before we started this activity, there was a woman who was stoned in public in the same village because she looked at a man who wasn't her husband. So if we want to foster the participation, and we did somehow here, we created that dialogue. But we had to challenge culture. At the same time, the Sendai framework tells us, okay, you have to respect culture, you have to look at indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge. There's a tension here. There's a tension between kind of our moral obligation and the cultural values. It's the classic humanitarian dilemma, right? All humanitarian workers have felt that feeling. If you're working in a patriarchal society and in a famine context, if you want to fit the most marginalized, that who may be most in need, maybe the women and the kids, you may have to bypass the traditional men leaders. If you want to respect the culture, then you may end up further marginalizing or starving those in need. It's tricky. I don't have the answer. Don't ask me the answer. I don't know. To me, it's about creating that dialogue. It's about making those, I mean, somehow, I'm providing an answer actually. It's about getting those with power to recognize the needs of the others. But we actually don't have to go that far, I guess. We're doing some work at the moment in a small island in East Arnhem called, or used to be called, Milingipi. At the moment it's Yowie. But in that particular place, we were doing some work on water resources, water management that could be seen from a DRR perspective as well. And with Yolu people there. And in that particular island, if the women fly over the island, they have to cover their eyes because only the TOs can have access or look at some particular places, like some billabongs and some very sacred places. And we can't challenge that. It would be culturally inappropriate. So how do we deal with that? I mean, it's a question we need to ask. It's important. It's tricky. I don't have there's no silver bullet answer to that. But I don't want to finish on a very kind of pessimistic or provocative note. I've got one more song, and it's a soft one to cool down this time after the punk, after the reggae. This is Johnny Cash, and this is 5 Feet High and Rising, which is about people's capacities dealing with rising water during the Mississippi floods back in the 1930s. So, and it's a short one, so I'm going to show you Johnny Cash to cool down and relax.
The water.
Do we have the time? 2 minutes to...
2 minutes? Johnny Cash.
The water talking. She said it's 2 feet high and rising.
Isn't it's a lot of feeling, but you know.
Thank you, Brad. But don't worry. It's not gonna be
just the one.
Anyway, I'm Malu. I actually am from the Philippines, and I'm now currently taking masters in University of Newcastle. Thank you for the presentation. Maybe one of the things I wanted to share, an experience I had in Japan. I facilitated a group, and our topic was on minority and inclusiveness. And one of the Japanese youth said, and which struck me most and made me really ponder on, because I thought all the while I had this hardcore definition of what minority and inclusiveness means. She said at some point we find ourselves as minority. there is minority in all of us. And in every group that we, for example, like religion, if I go to Indonesia, if my religion is a majority in the Philippines, if I go to Indonesia, I feel minority, or not having religion at all. Or maybe, like, there's like different aspects in our lives that makes us feel minority at some point, and I feel like we have to all be mindful about it. And the idea of inclusiveness, that not putting everybody in one box, like, this is one box, I want us all to fit in, but it's like, there are different sizes of box, get into where you feel you would fit in. And I think, because my work for the past 5 years is in humanitarian emergencies, and this is always a struggle, how to be very sensitive of the different sensitivities on the ground. And even earlier, when we were talking about media, there's just so many things running on my head, and I can't help but recall those 5 years in the field, where seeing different people with different needs. But maybe I just wanted to highlight the quote of one of your students, which you showed earlier, and it's very true. At the recovery or development phase, where we wanted to introduce the rights of women based on Philippine laws, so we gathered them. And we thought we have empowered them. You know, we say, oh, these are your rights, so you talk this out with your husbands. And husbands become very defensive. And sometimes, by sensitizing them of their rights, that became like a venue for their husbands to beat them. The husbands felt like it's a ego-bruising thing to realize that all these years, what they're doing with their wives are against the law. So we realized, okay, let's try to change the mechanism. Let's try to engage the men, because after all, they are our partners. So I just wanted to affirm that quote based on our experience in the field, that if we wanted to bring solutions to these issues, then we have to bring all the actors involved, and we don't create like this polarity that you are the villain and these are, you know, the victims. That's all.
Thank you, Jason.
I fully agree.
Over to you, Deb.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. That's picking up on my point too. When we were writing the LGBTI and emergency management report with Dale and Liam, we came right against this, you know, the contrast between that normative discrimination of men against women, against all the other kinds of diversity that there is. And I think it can be seen as quite dated, that binary of men and women. But the fact is that we do live in a patriarchal society, and you can see that in things like the pay gap, you know, violence against women, discrimination against women in pregnancy, objectification of women's bodies. And my thesis this afternoon is that 40% of people who die in bushfires in Australia are female. They're women and they're girls. And I think it's exactly because of that hierarchy of men over women, but it's so normalised that none of us see it. So I think it actually risks lives. So my question to you is, how can we bring that back into the discussion?
I mean, it's difficult. I mean, because there are two levels. One is the practical level and the policy level. I mean, the policy level, if we look at how gender has been included into some of the policies, it's often from the perspective of this binary. If you look, for example, at the sphere humanitarian standards, then you have X number of portaloos you need for X number of men, X number of women. If you don't fit the binary, then you don't get, you fall between the cracks. And it's even worse for the gender minorities that don't identify within the binary and within the LGBTIQ kind of affiliation as well, because it's something totally different, swinging between male and female identities, which is what the Fafafine or the Parla or the Warrior do sometimes. So it's very tricky. I mean, it's about lobbying, I guess. But as Maureen was saying yesterday, we need evidence, and we need more evidence than patchy kind of research we have at the moment. And I don't have a final answer. I don't have an actual answer to that kind of question. But it's about lobbying, I guess, from the inside.
Folks, time is against us. I'm sorry we can't get to your questions. Once again, please thank JC. Thanks, JC.